Let's start today with an example of a good policy idea, a just policy idea, going too far and then actually giving credence to the typically terrible right-wing arguments against it. I'm talking about the minimum wage. I'm going to play a clip for you from the debate for the Senate seat previously held by the late Senator Dianne Feinstein. Katie Porter's running for that seat. Adam Schiff is running for that seat. We've interviewed Adam Schiff and Barbara Lee. Katie Porter has ignored our requests for an interview. Here is Barbara Lee explaining why she believes we should have a $50 an hour minimum wage. Now, I'm here to tell you this would not make any sense whatsoever. And I tell you this as an advocate of increasing the minimum wage. What Barbara Lee advocates for here actually gives credibility to the reason Republicans oppose raising the minimum wage. I will explain in a moment. Let's take a listen.
You're calling for a $50 an hour federal minimum wage. That's 7 times the current national minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Can you explain how that would be economically sustainable for small businesses? You have 60 seconds.
First, let me say I owned and ran a small business for 11 years. I created hundreds of jobs. Benefits, retirement benefits, also health care benefits. I know what worker productivity means, and that means that you have to make sure that your employees are taken care of and have a living wage. In the Bay Area, I believe it was the United Way, came out with a report that very recently, $127,000 for a family of 4 is just barely enough to get by. Another survey very recently, $104,000 for a family of 1. Barely enough to get by. Low income because of the affordability crisis. And so just do the math. Just do the math. Of course, we have national minimum wages that we need to raise to a living wage. You're talking about $20, $25, fine. But I have got to be focused on what California needs and what the affordability factor.
So listen, there's a couple different things here. First of all, it is absolutely true that there are parts of California where if you're not making 6 figures, you are going to get pushed out pretty damn far before you can afford housing. That needs to be dealt with to some degree by building dramatically more housing, which we can't do because of building zoning ordinances, codes, and all sorts of other things. The housing issue has to be dealt with. You also have to remember that in most of California geographically, now I know that the population is overwhelmingly in the coastal cities, but in most of California geographically, the entire $50 an hour thing is completely implausible, even based on cost of living. But here's the problem with this idea. Even if we dealt with the housing issue, we need a higher minimum wage. The minimum wage is absurdly low federally. It's absurdly low in some states more than others. But this is what we call a good idea going too far, and we end up making the right-wing arguments viable. When the right wing goes, listen, if you give them a $16 minimum wage, next thing you know, they'll ask for a $50 minimum wage. And we on the left go, a $50 minimum wage isn't an equilibrium wage. It's not an inflation-adjusted wage. It's not a productivity adjusted. Nobody would do that. And then Barbara Lee goes, actually, yeah, we would want that. When the right says increasing the minimum wage will cause job losses, we say it wouldn't as long as it's a reasonable increase. We're not talking about a $50 or $100 minimum wage, which would cause job losses because it would be an out of sync wage relative to the surrounding economics of the area. And then all of a sudden she says, well, we actually do need a $50 minimum wage. A $50 minimum wage on a global scale could make domestic businesses be at an even bigger competitive disadvantage and hurt the macroeconomy of the United States. If you set the minimum wage so far above the equilibrium wage, you can create labor market distortions with an oversupply of workers for these new $50 an hour minimum wage jobs. This will leave other important jobs open and unfilled, which can cause all sorts of problems depending on what types of jobs those are. It's a misallocation of resources. It will reduce the incentive for many people to pursue the sorts of higher education that we need in order to stimulate innovation when it comes to medications and all sorts of life-saving products, et cetera. It will tamp that down. So We need a well-calibrated increase to the minimum wage. If you find the right number for the minimum wage, it's a great thing for the economy. Workers who earn minimum wage tend to spend a higher portion of their income on consumption, which is demand-side stimulus for the local economy. Most minimum wage workers, you give them a reasonable equilibrium raise, they'll spend a lot of that money in their local economies. That creates more jobs. It's a good thing. And a couple of ways that you could do this would be tie the minimum wage to inflation or tie the minimum wage to productivity growth. And this is a way to make sure that the lowest paid workers don't fall behind without going so far that you start to damage the economy. You'll still improve worker productivity with a nice inflation-adjusted wage, and you'll do a lot of good for the economy. So to give you some hypothetical numbers, if the minimum wage rose in step with inflation dating back to 1968, you'd be talking about something in the low 20s. And similarly, if it went with productivity, you'd be talking about $22 or $23 an hour. You can justify that. Maybe not in every market in the United States. You know, there are parts of Mississippi where cost of living is really, really low. Can you make an economic justification for a $22.50 minimum wage there? Maybe not. But in much of the country, including many of our urban and population centers, the fight for 15, listen, that was 4 years ago. There's been inflation since then. There's been 5, 6 years ago even. You can make a really good empirical argument for a $21 or $22 minimum wage, certainly in many states and urban centers. $50 minimum wage is not an equilibrium wage, and it just gives fodder to the right-wingers who say this is a slippery slope. Next thing you know, they'll want $75 an hour, $100 an hour, when it is not economically defensible. I have no moral issue with people making $50 an hour, but I am not finding a way economically and empirically to defend that, and that's the point. You've heard me talk before about the show's financial accounts being hacked. It is a horrible experience. It can happen to anyone. Look at the stats, and our sponsor, Aura, gives you peace of mind. Aura is the all-in-one solution to keep your accounts safe. Aura scans the dark web for your personal info, emails, passwords, social security numbers, and alerts you if anything is found and helps you fix the problem fast. You also get alerts about suspicious credit inquiries. Aura protects all of your devices from malware with state-of-the-art antivirus, and Aura helps you manage what your kids can do on their devices with really easy-to-use parental controls. You can try Aura for free for 2 weeks at aura.com/Pacman. Your usernames and passwords could already be floating around. It takes just seconds to find out using Aura's free trial, so you can change your passwords if you need to. The link is down below.